Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, Brownfield Contaminants in Human Health, hosted by NJIT Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities, or NJIT TAB. We're excited to have you all here, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to spend it with us, expanding your Brownfield knowledge. My name is Fatima Matos, and I am the Events Coordinator here at NJIT's Center for Community Systems. Mimi Marcus, our Manager for Marketing and Engagement, and I will be helping to facilitate today's webinar. Before we get started, I first want to go over some ground rules. 1. This session will be recorded. All recordings and presentations shown today will be available on our website at www.njit.edu/tab. 2. If you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A window to post them. To access this window, click the Q&A button on your toolbar found at the bottom of your screen. You may upvote questions if you see one that resonates with you or would also like to know the answer to. Questions will be read and answered at the end of the presentation. If you feel comfortable, we could also unmute you, and you could speak your questions if you feel that texting them might not be, you have a little bit more information or there's a little bit more nuance that you want to convey. Feel free to do that as well. If there's a question that can't be answered today, feel free to visit our LinkedIn event page for today's webinar, where we could connect and answer those questions for you. Feel free to also engage further in discussion there as well. I'm sure there are attendees here today that have a vast wealth of knowledge on different areas of brownfield redevelopment. Continue the conversation and learning after today's webinar. 3. Don't have a question but have something to say? Feel free to use the chat window to express yourself. The chat button can also be found on your toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We want to hear your thoughts as you listen to our panelists today. Is there something you're excited to learn about, really vibing with the content and want to let everyone know? Feel free to let it all out. We want to hear from you. To get everyone into the groove, let us know in the chat. I know Mimi asked earlier, where is everyone coming from? If you haven't answered that, answer it now. Do you all hail from the Garden State, or are we a little farther away? From what I've seen so far, it looks like we're having good representation from both EPA regions 2 and 4. Great to see. And on that note, Mimi will be moderating our chat and posting some great links and resources relevant to today's discussion, so feel free to check the chat as you listen. To review, type questions in the Q&A window and comments in the chat window. 4. If you run into any technical issues during today's webinar, if you know of any attendees that are having any trouble accessing this webinar, feel free to email me at fm392@njit.edu. I believe Mimi will post that email in the link as well. I'll be monitoring my email and will provide technical assistance as needed, so don't worry, we've got your back. Lastly, at the end of this webinar, you will be directed to a feedback survey. Our goal is to serve brownfield communities to the best of our ability. We would love to hear your thoughts so that we can provide resources and materials that align with your goals and needs. If you have an idea for a future webinar regarding a topic you're interested in learning more about, feel free to provide that feedback as well. We want to create content that works for you. Now, with those rules out of the way, we can begin. It is my pleasure to introduce a gentleman whose passion for brownfield sites has led him to his career in environmental science with a focus on environmental remediation, Mr. Joseph M. Reiner. Joseph, or Joe as most folks call him, a Brownfield Redevelopment Specialist for NJIT Center for Community Systems. He utilizes his training as an environmental scientist to assist communities in developing specific strategies to overcome their brownfield challenges. They say walk a mile in a man's shoes to understand them better. Well, Joe has walked many miles through brownfields and other contaminated sites during his career, has taken part in large and small field investigations, and has provided health and safety oversight on construction and engineering projects involving contaminated land. He is here to share that understanding and knowledge with you today. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Joe.
Great, and thanks a lot, Fatima. I was an attendee that was experiencing technical difficulties joining, so I do apologize for that. But I want to thank you for joining me today to discuss a topic that I know might raise questions and cause concerns, and that's the historic contamination that's associated with brownfield sites and what it might mean for our health when we have contaminated brownfields in our communities. I can go ahead and jump to the conclusion that the answer to that last part depends. And it depends on several things. Maybe several questions spring to mind, but we're seeking to ultimately answer, is there any chance that this contamination is impacting my family's or my health? If you have a brownfield reuse project, or maybe there's just some brownfield sites in your town, maybe you've asked yourself something like this, or maybe you're asking yourself what the heck a brownfield even is. So before we start our main program, I'd like to give a brief introduction and the agenda for today. I'm Joe Reiner, an environmental scientist here in New Jersey, where I've come to specialize in environmental regulations. These are the rules that govern how we're to handle and treat chemicals that get released and travel through the environment. But before all that, I was just someone who was concerned about the chemicals in my environment. I knew my town had a contaminated site because older folks would talk to me about it. It was a big dye factory that closed down in the 60s, and they would also talk to me about how it polluted the stream running through the property. I looked at things in the news like life expectancy maps, and I saw patterns around the area where I grew up, which is an area with former industry. I didn't know what to make of it, and looking back, I guess that site in my town did sort of catalyze the career I wound up with, because I didn't understand what the site was supposed to mean for my neighborhood, and I didn't know what it meant for my health. But I wanted to know, because knowing about contamination in our communities empowers individuals like you and me. It equips us with the tools to overcome anxiety and uncertainty, and it can even inspire us to take stock, call attention to, and facilitate actions that improve our lives. I know contamination isn't something that's going to, really inspire warm and fuzzy feelings, but I'm not trying to monger up fear, nor am I here to tell you that the sky is falling. I just want to point out that to envision tangible solutions, we need to understand the problems we have, and we ideally should approach them with some clarity. As a Brownfield Redevelopment Specialist at NJIT's TAB program, I'm super excited to share my experience with environmental contaminants to help provide others some clarity in understanding their problems and envisioning their own solutions. So now that we know who I am, today's discussion is going to start with some definitions. We'll talk about what brownfields and what contaminants are. Then we'll cover some of the more common contaminants that are discovered at brownfields. We'll go a bit into their chemistry, their uses, and why they ended up there. Then we'll focus on how these chemicals might end up inside our bodies, the certain pathways different compounds might take. And we'll end by touching upon some of the screening and mapping tools that are out there to help us determine where contamination might be in our neighborhoods, to help us get a fuller picture of any human health impacts. When we quantify those impacts, it's useful just for purposes of tracking public health, but that information could also become an asset for municipal planning or obtaining money for cleanup or redevelopment from the government. So let's start our conversation with this image right here. Pictured here is a coal-fired power plant. This station was left unused following the site's closure after the company sold off its coal assets. After sitting vacant for about a decade, the plant was demolished last year. There are currently no future plans for the property, according to the company that owns it. So when you hear the words contamination or pollution, smokestacks like this one here, billowing thick smoke, might come to mind. We know these types of industrial activities do cause pollution, but even after their operations end, it's possible that some past production or waste handling has left contaminated material behind. But what is a brownfield? This is the EPA's definition of it. And we can see here that in this definition, a unifying theme of brownfield sites is property that is vacant due to the presence or perception of contamination on them. The site's not necessarily contaminated, but it's not assumed to be clean because of its prior or industrial uses. The perception is what counts here. So brownfield's a real estate term, and a key characteristic of a brownfield site is that it can be strategically targeted for redevelopment, because despite their obstacles, brownfield sites present some unique redevelopment opportunities. When we clean up and reinvest in them, it increases local tax bases, it can facilitate job growth, oftentimes it'll utilize existing infrastructure, and it takes development pressure off undeveloped open land, and I believe most importantly, it improves and protects the environment. Brownfields are found in almost every community. A brownfield can be as large as a massive manufacturer that spanned operations across several hundred acres, or it can be as small as a former gas station on 1/10 of an acre. So the size of the site is not determining the designation of a brownfield site. Neither is the contamination type or even the presence of contamination. And brownfields aren't just the obvious industrial sites like this power plant. They can be urban. like the former manufacturing facility over here. Kind of sticks out today in a residential neighborhood. Common brownfield sites are things like former dry cleaners, former auto repairs, and obviously closed landfills, but brownfields can be found in unanticipated places. There are many rural brownfields, like this field over here. We can't see the buildings that used to be there, but things like the groundwater monitoring well kind of give us a clue of potential environmental issues with the property. This is the EPA's definition of a pollutant. I won't read this, but the EPA has a law called CERCLA. It's also known as the Superfund law that tells us that a pollutant or a contaminant is anything, any material that can make us sick or even cause our death if it enters our body after being released into the environment. It's a legal definition here, and its significance is the very wide net that it casts. The terms pollutant and contaminant are interchangeable here, but I should make a bit of an informal distinction. So contamination is when a substance is in a place it shouldn't be, above a natural background level, whereas pollution is contamination that can or already has caused harmful effects on the environment. Contamination can cause pollution, but it doesn't always lead to it. And contamination is usually localized to a single or a few related sources, whereas pollution is a term for more extensive human-caused phenomena, like smog from vehicle exhausts or microplastics in the ocean. On such a massive and diffuse scale like this, we call it non-point source pollution, meaning there's no one source to attribute it to because we all cause it, some more than others. But today's webinar focuses on the contaminants most discovered at brownfield sites in the United States. These are called legacy pollutants, and they're remnants of our country's productive past. This timeline stretches back to the earliest days that emerged after European colonization, through the last century's explosion of warehouses, factories, production plants, and their transit lines on roads, train tracks, and in our waterways. The products and wastes produced by these industries can be left behind in the environment long after they are introduced. I'm sure most of us here have heard of things like lead, petroleum, asbestos. Some of us might be familiar with volatile organic compounds. Simply put, these materials weren't recognized as harmful when they were first being used. What was acceptable even in the 1950s or 60s would be intolerable to us today. People just didn't know the damage that some of these materials caused. They didn't know the long-term effects of them that we do now. I took this table from a recent EPA publication that I used as the basis of much of today's discussion. Let's think about some of the past uses that are listed here. We've got things like mining, piping, insulation, dry cleaning. When you look around your community, what past uses might you see? Understanding a property's history can help identify these types of past activities, both in the use of materials and the way that they were disposed. Knowing this information allows us to anticipate contaminants that may pose health or environmental risks, and knowing the anticipated contaminants might also reduce economic worries. Without that information, liability concerns or the costs of cleaning up a brownfield site are likely to increase. So brownfield contamination is not limited to these, but these 8 contaminant types are the most reported from cleanups using EPA brownfield grants. I'm concentrating our discussion on a handful of these, but I'd honestly love to take a deep dive into each on its own. So if that's something you're interested in seeing, please let us know in today's post-webinar survey. All right, one last thing before moving on. I want to say we're covering contamination issues distinct from those of emerging contaminants that could also harm the environment, like new chemicals used in prescription drugs or personal care products. It's a different can of legal regulatory worms, but I mention them because they are not distinct issues from a health risk and exposure perspective. And though it's beyond today's discussion, the combined impacts of non-point source pollution, emerging contaminants, and legacy pollutants can tell us interconnected stories of human health challenges presented by our built environment. Okay, let's get into maybe the most well-known legacy pollutant in the United States, lead. Lead is a naturally occurring metal. Its abundance in the Earth's crust, relatively low cost, and desirable physical properties led to, no pun intended, extensive human uses dating back thousands of years. In American brownfields, lead may be present at sites that conducted operations like mining, manufacturing, auto repairs, agriculture, or on railroads. It might also be present in homes or in public or commercial buildings if they were built prior to 1978, when lead-based paint was banned for residential use. Lead-based paints and materials were used on structures, equipment, or for soldering or making repairs. There's also an organic lead compound called tetraethyl lead that was used as a gasoline additive for many years. This is an extremely hazardous substance. It's highly toxic to the brain, and it's been banned in most countries for at least 2 decades, including in the United States since 1996, although it's allegedly manufactured illegally in China. So lead enters the environment from these past uses, and from current uses, it's emitted from industrial sources. Think back to that generating station smokestack. When it's released into the air, it can travel long distance, settling on the ground, sticking to soil particles. Depending on the soil characteristics, mainly soil acidity, it can dissolve into surface water or migrate through the ground into groundwater. However, the most common sources of lead in our drinking water today is corrosion of plumbing systems, or even from natural deposits. The former case is a well-documented infrastructural issue in the United States, unfortunately. Okay, asbestos. Asbestos is another contaminant that's been pretty famous for its human health effects. Like lead, asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral fiber. There are actually 6 types of asbestos, but they're all needle-like and with high durability and heat resistance. Asbestos-containing products have been made and used for thousands of years, but it wasn't until the end of the 1800s that asbestos use really skyrocketed in the United States. And that's with asbestos-containing construction materials, as well as in brakes and clutches for automobiles. So when asbestos-containing material is moved or disturbed, microscopic asbestos fibers are released and stay airborne for several days. Most buildings that were built prior to the 1980s still contain asbestos, and asbestos mining has been widely banned, with over 60 countries outlawing it for any purpose, including the entire EU, the UK, Japan, and Australia. Import and use in small amounts in the United States is still legal. Russia is currently the world's largest asbestos miner and producer. I'll admit asbestos contamination is typically handled by industrial hygienists, and I don't have much experience with it. Most of my work has brought me outside and into the ground as opposed to inside structures. All right, petroleum products. We all know petroleum because our world runs on it, but defining what it is kind of difficult. Petroleum is a broad name for naturally occurring mixtures of hydrocarbons, which are literally just chains of hydrogen and carbon atoms linked together. Petroleum is usually found underground in certain rock and soil types, and there are hundreds of types of it. We call it crude oil when it's in its unaltered natural state, but human ingenuity has led to many industrial and commercial uses of it through processes of extracting and refining, where the crude oil is changed into valued products like gasoline, diesel fuel, kerosene, or heating oil. So petroleum products are not any one chemical. It's a catch-all term for crude oil and all the refined products made from it. Some might be clear, watery liquids that can readily evaporate, whereas some might be viscous, dark liquids, or even semi-solids. Many have a distinct odor that's easy to identify. Because it's so widely used, petroleum contamination is also widespread. Any site that stored fuel to power equipment or vehicles has the potential to be contaminated with it. So we're talking gas stations, auto repairs, power generation, mining, metalworks, agriculture, other types of manufacturing. Any site that stored fuel for heating might also have petroleum contamination, which includes many private and public buildings like homes, retail businesses, and government offices. As I've said, our world runs on this stuff. Petroleum is released to the land and into water through oil spills, which I'm sure we've all heard of, and leaks from old storage tanks. Here in this image, we see an attractive young man standing next to an excavated underground storage tank, or UST. The storage tank held about 2,000 gallons of fuel oil when it was in the ground. And looking at this here, there are a number of irregular shaped holes located along the hull of it. So when USTs like this one become damaged or forgotten about, they act as sources of petroleum contamination. Oil spilled across water bodies floats, usually spreads out across the surface in a process called dispersion. Petroleum spilt into the ground builds up in open air pockets called soil pores where it's also dispersed. In both cases, it's weathered, broken down by some natural processes in the environment. Some of the lighter components will just evaporate. So the heaviest and thickest compounds can stick to soil particles and sink into the ground with them, like lead. Some bacteria and fungi will actually eat the hydrocarbons, using them as a source of energy. This is a complex metabolic activity called biodegradation. All this works to degrade petroleum, and weathering is determined by the chemical composition of the original hydrocarbon mixture, but the weathering processes affect toxicity of the final hydrocarbon mixture in the environment. So all these facts, that petroleum is not any one compound, but a name for hundreds of compounds sharing similar chemistry, that crude oil is refined into many petroleum products, and that petroleum undergoes differential weathering after being released into the environment, can make quantifying and understanding its contamination a little confusing. Sometimes we might just be interested in the total amount of petroleum hydrocarbons in a location. That can tell us whether or not it's even present and how much is, but not much else. We usually need to analyze the petroleum in fractions of the whole, meaning comparing like this 8-carbon petroleum product to this 3-carbon petroleum product. When we quantify these different fractions, it affords us some clarity towards which specific petroleum components are present, and that helps us anticipate health or environmental issues. And in fact, many states have separate regulations and procedures for conducting petroleum investigations because of these factors. All right, before we get into this last one, let's get some semantics out of the way. Volatile organic compound is a super broad term, and in truth, there are tens of thousands of VOCs, many of which occur naturally, being emitted by vegetation as aromatics or through forest fires as byproducts of that combustion, but many of these are not very commercially viable. The EPA regulates industrial VOCs for smog that produces ozone, which is an issue of non-point pollution, but VOCs in the context of brownfield contamination typically present different risks that we'll talk about. But what are they? What are VOCs? Simplest definition, VOCs are carbon compounds that evaporate at room temperature. So we can roughly subdivide them based on reactivity. We have very volatile organics, are those that are so reactive in air, they exist almost only as gases. Things like propane and butane. On the other side of the spectrum, we have semi-volatile organics, or those that vaporize less readily at standard temp and pressure. SVOCs include a lot of pesticides, some fire retardants, and are usually the tiniest fraction of VOCs in air. They might be found in liquids, soils, or in dust and building materials. There are also differing VOC chemistries. We have aromatic hydrocarbons that are commonly found in petroleum products, like benzene, that partially makes up the lighter components of gasoline. I want to note that aromatic hydrocarbons are both VOCs and petroleum products, and that's based on our very wide definition of these words. Other common VOCs are chlorinated solvents like TCE, trichloroethene, which has been used as an industrial degreaser for dry cleaning, paint thinners, or parts cleaners for machinery. Chlorinated solvents are synthetic compounds, meaning these are chemicals that you will not encounter in natural settings. They've been made from natural precursors solely by humans for human use. The need for solvents in dry cleaning, auto repair, metal recycling, and many manufacturing operations makes VOCs potential contaminants in these past use activities, and their use for disinfecting and pest control also means that many residences, office buildings, and farmland could be contaminated. VOCs become contaminants in spills of petroleum products or chemical solvents from storage drums or during transit. They can be released underground through damaged USTs that we talked about, or leaking sewer or process pipes, or even in stormwater runoff. Once in the ground, some VOCs will adhere to soil solids and remain in place, but other VOCs will dissolve into groundwater, migrate through the ground in a chemical plume in the water. VOCs also evaporate from the soil and the groundwater into soil vapors. These volatile vapors can then rise and squeeze through the ground into buildings through cracks in foundations and slabs, where they can be inhaled by people inside. This process is called vapor intrusion, and it's a primary concern for VOC contamination. You might have noticed that lead, petroleum, asbestos, and many VOCs are naturally occurring. They can be hazardous just in their natural states, but their true risk lies in the historic extraction, alteration, and use of them for human enterprise. I chose to focus on those 4 contaminant types today because of how extensive their past and in many cases present uses are. It reasons to follow that many brownfield sites would have at least one, likely some combination of them present, needing to be addressed if the site is to be put back into reuse. Let's say a former gas station had damaged USTs that leaked petroleum products into the ground. We know that petroleum products can contain VOCs that migrate into and contaminate groundwater. The old building itself might have asbestos-containing construction materials or lead-based paint or piping that could affect air quality in and near the site. Basically, environmental contamination is intricate and it can be costly to assess and to address. But beyond that, I hope you can start to appreciate how the story of contaminants doesn't just end with them sitting in the ground or building materials at old sites. Many times these contaminants can take on dynamic chemical lives beyond their release. They attach themselves and migrate with dust particles in the air, or down through the soil and rock into groundwater, where they can move with its general flow direction. Brownfield sites may not even hold a high amount of contamination, so in theory, this may happen on a very diffuse scale over many years. Though we covered the most common brownfield contaminants, their hazards and their severity are really going to differ depending on the industry that previously occupied the site. And I focus on site use so much because understanding that past use affords us clarity to understand health risks posed by the brownfield site. So I'll go back to that question I asked a while ago. What past uses might you see in your community? Do any of the uses we discussed reflect your community's unused properties or vacant structures? So now let's pivot a bit and talk a bit about the human health portion of today's webinar. To begin this, I want to talk about exposure pathways and what is meant by that. Exposure pathways refer to how people come into contact or are exposed to a contaminant. The exposure pathway is the physical course a contaminant takes from its source to what's called the receptor, the person being exposed. So when we characterize an exposure pathway, we have to consider the fate and transport of the contaminant, meaning how it behaves in the environment and how or if it will come into contact with humans. Background in chemistry or geology helps quite a bit, but there is some common sense involved in this as well. If a contaminant is emitted into the air, it will be available to the surrounding human and ecological community in the ambient air, probably in the direction of prevailing winds. If it's discharged into a river, then it will be available to the water and the organisms in the water. So an exposure pathway contains 5 elements. I'll blow up this image from the Agency for Toxic Substances because I think it explains this concept really well. We've got 1, a source of contamination. Here it's these poorly kept drums, but it can really be any source area. We discussed several in the previous section. 2, contaminant transport through the environment. There's a few different kinds illustrated here. We've got volatilization into air, which we discussed. We also have some spill onto the ground, into the soil, and then migrating as a soil gas, as well as leaching into groundwater. 3, an exposure point. These are just places you can be exposed. It doesn't matter how toxic the substance is, it can't harm you if you aren't exposed to it. Note that the household plumbing on the right over here is an exposure point. This might happen if we have wells for potable use installed in a contaminated aquifer that's downstream or down gradient of a contamination source. 4, an exposure route. And there are a few listed here we'll talk about in a bit. We've got ingestion, which is literally just eating or drinking it. Inhalation, which is breathing it in. But we also have dermal contact, which is when we touch the stuff with our bare skin. This might happen if we swim or bathe in contaminated water, or if we handle contaminated material without gloves. And the final thing that we need in an exposure pathway is a receptor population. That's you, me, us, our children, our animals, etc. we can define and evaluate receptors in the environment. And in environmental investigations, there's usually some form of this involved in the remedial investigation phase to help determine properly protective cleanup measures. Food chain's also listed as an exposure point. I'll just briefly touch on this. This is when plants are growing in contaminated soil or taking up contaminated water, and we eat those plants or we eat animals that have eaten those plants. It's a complex ecological process called biomagnification that's way beyond today's discussion related to brownfields, but I just do want to point its existence out on this slide. For now, let's bring it back to those common brownfield contaminants and quickly touch upon exposure routes. I hope it's obvious that we can and we do breathe contaminants in the air, or we ingest them in contaminated water or food, or we absorb them through our skin when we touch them. These contaminants might be in the form of microscopic particles like dust or vapors, traveling through the ambient air or through the ground, or as dissolved constituents in water. We just learned that when we mitigate potential impacts of environmental contaminants, we evaluate the inhalation, ingestion, and dermal contact exposure routes. This line chart up here illustrates the basic concept of an exposure route. There's a lot of terminology, but the main takeaway is that there's a difference between the amount you are exposed to and the amount that's taken up by your body. Depending on the route, some of the chemical might be exhaled back out, or just pass through our digestive system, or is just not completely in contact with our skin when we're touching it. The extent of both exposure and our body's absorption depends on how much contaminant is present, how a person is exposed, how long they've been exposed, and how often they've been exposed. Contaminants do cause a range of health effects when a person is exposed and they're absorbed into our body. I'm not an epidemiologist, so I can't go into specific biomechanisms that they exert, but we can briefly touch upon some of the documented human health effects, the contaminants we learned about. This table lists some of the more unsavory impacts that common brownfield contaminants can have on human health. You can see some of the impacts, nasty things like cancer, respiratory damage, lung scarring, nervous system damage. Some of these health impacts are more infamous than others. There's lead poisoning, which has been extensively documented. When it enters our bloodstream, lead replaces metals like calcium, zinc, or iron that are essential to normal cellular functions, disrupting them in all organ systems and leading to these negative health impacts listed here. With lead, ingestion is a primary concern for children, but inhalation is another major route. Dermal contact is a risk for those working with organic lead. PEL in leaded gasoline absorbs through the skin and has immediate effects on the brain and central nervous system. It affects motor skills and causes abnormal behavior. Asbestosis. This is a term given to long-term inflammation and scarring of the lungs from inhaling asbestos fibers, symptoms like difficulty breathing, coughing, or chest tightness. Complications of asbestosis can lead to lung cancers, mesothelioma, which is a name we give to cancer that grows on the lining of our lungs, and heart diseases. It's a risk for people doing DIY renovations, and that's why it's generally recommended that currently existing and undamaged asbestos simply be left undisturbed. It's also likely why it's so represented as a brownfield-specific contaminant. Redevelopment projects might involve construction or some demolition of older structures, and that brings on-site workers into close contact with it. Electricians, HVAC techs, construction workers, and industrial hygienists are all at an increased risk of asbestos exposure. And there are many illnesses associated with hydrocarbon toxicity, depending on the specific VOC or petroleum product. Ingestion is a less important but possible route. This is what happens when we drink dissolved VOCs in contaminated drinking water. But inhalation is a common exposure route, and that leads to ear, nose, and throat irritation and asthma-like symptoms over time. There's also strong evidence that aromatic and chlorinated hydrocarbons, so your benzene and your TCE that we talked about, are carcinogenic, meaning that exposure leads to cancers. Per the EPA, TCE is a carcinogen by all routes of exposure. In lab studies, lifetime exposure results in increased occurrence of liver, kidney, and testicular cancers in mice and rats. The EPA also classifies benzene as a carcinogen by all exposure routes. Benzene impacts our bone marrow and causes anemia. Increased occurrence of leukemia or cancer of the blood cells has been documented in people occupationally exposed to benzene. But as I've said, there's a difference between the contaminants that we might be exposed to and the amount our body ultimately takes in. Just because we're exposed to a contaminant doesn't necessarily mean we will develop any of the range of symptoms I just discussed. How much contamination and how long we're exposed matters a lot, as well as the exposure route. In the context of brownfields, addressing contamination is a goal because these are sites that could just be shrouded in mystery. The sites may have no history of environmental assessment or cleanup. They may have shuttered operations prior to regulations even being established. And there is no official list of brownfield sites. People who live, work, go to school, play, or exercise on or near a property may not realize it's a brownfield site. They may not know walking or playing on site might cause exposure to contaminants. The amount of contamination we're usually exposed to is far less than the amount that can cause health problems. However, that's not the case for everyone, and some groups of people simply cannot tolerate exposure as well as others. These groups of people are known as sensitive population, comprised of at-risk individuals. There are some examples of sensitive populations and at-risk individuals listed here. This list includes obvious groups like children, pregnant and nursing women, people with chronic conditions, and the elderly, but it also includes some groups we may not immediately think of, people who may be socially, culturally, or geographically isolated, like individuals with pharmacological dependency or experiencing homelessness, or of some other low socioeconomic status. Let's use a well-researched example with children and lead poisoning. Because of its systemic impacts, lead poisoning causes developmental problems in children that are not as emergent in adults. Childhood lead exposures have been shown to cause learning disability and behavioral problems, among other symptoms. Children with iron or calcium deficiencies are also at an increased risk for lead poisoning due to lead's affinity for taking the place of essential metals inside the body. There are also behavioral and physiological reasons that put children at higher risk. They're more likely to breathe dust and vapor because they're closer to the ground. They also breathe at a quicker rate relative to their body sizes. They're more likely to put their hands in their mouths. Sometimes they might eat dirt. Most importantly, their bodies are creating new tissue because they're growing. These tissues are especially sensitive to chemical exposures. My main point here is that health impacts are not equally felt by all members of the community. And to sort of underscore that, I'm going to bring us on a quick detour here. About 15 years ago, a group of Indianapolis-based researchers conducted a study on the spatial relationship, meaning the distance relationship between urban lead sources and blood lead levels in children living in the city. To explore this environmental health relationship, the team did a few things on the community level. First, they collected 250 soil samples from 2007 to 2009 in an analysis of lead distribution in the city's west side, or what they're calling Westco neighborhood. At the southern end of this study area is a remediated Superfund site that had remediation activities for lead take place in the 90s, involving removing contaminated soils from the site and from topsoil at surrounding residences. Some soil samples were collected from inside the remediated area and from areas near the site. They also measured the lead levels from inside 7 neighborhood homes. They did this by measuring the lead in dust collected on air filters inside the home's vents over a 1-year period. One of these homes was directly across the street from the remediated Superfund site. The homes were all roughly the same age, so the effect of lead-based paint was considered mostly uniform for this study, and the researchers used analytical lab methods to quantify the lead concentrations in parts per million. To compare these results, they pulled existing blood lead level data from over 12,000 children recorded over a 10-year period, from 1999 to 2008. They mined these medical records from an electronic database used in the city's hospital systems at the time and included all children aged 0 to 5 years with an address in the county with at least one record of blood lead level recorded. They also collected basic demographic information like race, ethnicity, age, and sex, and insurance status as a proxy for income. They mapped these demographics of the study population into block and block groups using the most recent census data. From there, they performed statistical evaluations and they compared the separate sets of data, exploring if any conclusions or spatial patterns could be drawn from it. To summarize their findings, there were lead hotspots in soils just north of the remediated Superfund site and north of a highway corridor that runs through the middle of the study area. The remediated area's soil lead was lower than average, reflecting the cleanup activity in the area. There is a correlation between lead levels in nearby soils and in household dust. This was true for 6 of the 7 houses in the study, with the outlier being the house across the street from the Superfund site. Its indoor dust levels were much higher compared to its outdoor soil levels. Children living in the Westco neighborhood had higher blood lead levels than the fuller data set at both the zip code and the county-wide level. This was true for both the geometric mean and average, as well as the percentage of children with elevated blood lead levels. There were no apparent spatial relationships between elevated blood lead levels and the soil lead concentration at the census block and block group scale. Race was the highest indicator of elevated blood lead levels in children at this scale, with most of the city's non-Hispanic Black population living in the north and central portions of the city and also experiencing the highest levels of blood lead. So, hang on a second. Oops. Sorry. There we go. The conclusions that they came to were that the spatial differences in racial composition indicated elevated blood lead levels more than the spatial differences in soil lead concentrations. They don't hypothesize why race was such a strong indicator. Correlation is not causation, right? There's nothing about being Black that medically puts one at higher risk of lead poisoning, but variations in the soil lead concentrations were attributed to traffic and other ongoing industrial sources. Further, they suggest the one house with very high lead levels not matching its soil levels might be from fugitive lead dust being emitted from contaminated soil around the remediated site. The study didn't account for these confounding factors, and the conclusions sort of open more questions up that branch into environmental justice and social equity, but such is the nature of good scientific research. At the time, what this team did in combining environmental and health data might have been considered novel or complex, but in the years that have passed since, this profound need to bridge, got 5 minutes, let me just dismiss that. This profound need to compare information more closely across these disciplines was widely recognized by public health authorities and researchers. Today, it's given rise to a number of community screening tools designed to enable each of us to perform our own sort of spatial analyses, not unlike what Dr. Morrison and her team did here. So to round off our discussion, let's go through the functions of a few of them. EPA's EJScreen. So in 2015, the EPA released EJScreen. It's an environmental justice tool for mapping and screening that provides a national data set combining environmental and demographic indicators. Okay, but what does that mean? So it's a GIS map, and users load on their web browsers. You choose a geographic area, like an address or town, and the map focuses on that location, then provides socioeconomic and environmental information for it. The environmental indicators vary widely in what they tell us. They're listed here on the left. Some represent estimates of ambient air pollutants like ozone or diesel particulates. Some quantify distance to exposure sources like nearby hazardous waste sites or traffic. The socioeconomic indicators are used as very general signs of the community's susceptibility to differing environmental stressors, and users can combine these indicators into what are called EJ and supplemental indices on the right here. Both these indices are designed to give us a bit of flexibility within the ways that we can analyze environmental health data. It provides a utility for mapping and report generation and comparison, showing how an area matches up to the state or to the nation. These percentiles help to show the degree of burden a community faces. So, for example, a community with multiple sensitive populations living near several sources of contamination would result in a higher EJ index, implying a higher degree of community need for environmental actions or justice enforcements. There's also the Council of Environmental Quality's CEJST, or Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. This is a newer GPS tool released a couple years ago by the executive branch. I don't want to get political here, but this is the policy planning tool of Biden's Justice 40 initiative, which aims to allot 40% of federal program investments to disadvantaged communities overburdened by pollution and other environmental justice issues like climate change. So while EJScreen is meant to serve as sort of a public screening tool for generating community reports with a bit of degree of customization, CEJST's main function is for federal agencies to help ID disadvantaged communities who would benefit from the initiative. The map uses indicators of burden like EJScreen, one of which is legacy pollution, and shows information about port burdens in discrete census tracts, which are just small geographic units like the block and block groups used in the Indianapolis study. Like EJScreen, CEJST ranks these burdens using percentiles that show the level and type of burden each tract experiences compared to others. So its interface is simple compared to EJScreen, and that makes it good for quickly obtaining and measuring burdens in a community. For example, we can see here that my hometown of Haledon is ID'd as disadvantaged, not because of legacy pollution, though I'll point out we are in the 89th percentile for proximity to hazardous waste sites, but because of workforce development issues. Haledon is in the 90th percentile for linguistic isolation, and 12% of our adults over age 25 do not have a high school diploma. There's the CDC's tracking network. They've put extensive and highly collaborative efforts into this tracking network. It's probably the most robust data source for our purposes of assessing human health. The project's origins go way back to 2001, when the need for this type of tracking was simply recognized. And in the years since, the database was designed, built, and implemented across several disciplines like epidemiology, computer science, and health education to provide a network of non-infectious disease and environmental data from a national partnership. The CDC gives out funding and cooperative agreements to local health departments for building their own tracking programs. And the purpose of this tracking network is to drive actions that improve community health. So categories like childhood lead poisoning can be defined and targeted by geography. Here I've used the example of childhood lead poisoning, which screens for risk based on the age of homes. So in lieu of access to like private medical records, things like this, the presence of lead-based paint inside older structures can be a proxy for the risk of lead poisoning. And the functions of this tracking network help support epidemiological studies, identify and educate at-risk communities, and ultimately inform health policy that impacts municipal or even state planning. It targets risk prevention. In some sense, I feel like this tracking network kind of crawled so things like EJScreen and CEJST could run today. Just a few others I want to touch upon. There's EnviroFacts, with a network of over 20 databases that aggregates and maps environmental information from facilities that have to report to the EPA. In EnviroFacts, I can find that contaminated site from my town and follow its regulatory status, get an idea of what cleanup activities have or haven't happened. Another one is the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. It's an annual information survey with demographic details on income, housing, health, education. It supplements the 10-year census. And I can use this data to see that my town's rate of disability is about on par with the state as a whole, but maybe we have a higher percentage of individuals who struggle with independent living. This census data also shows me that my town has over 10% of people with no health insurance at all. So maybe you can start to see how a story can be interpreted from these various sources. All right, we've reached the end of today's discussion. I'm just going to quickly recap what I hope you're taking away. Brownfields are vacant sites that are often unused due to perceptions of contamination. Contaminants originate from different sources, travel, and persist differently in the environment. Understanding site history informs what type of contamination may be present and what risks may be posed to your community. The amount, time frame, and type of contamination and exposure pathway can inform the extent of negative health impacts, sensitive populations, and your greater risks. Contamination can be expensive, cause fear, and pose hazards. There are publicly available data tools to help quantify negative community impacts, inform municipal planning, and allot funding. I must now admit that the title Brownfield Contaminants in Human Health is a bit of a misnomer. From the human health perspective, there really is no differentiating the impacts of legacy pollutants from those of emerging contaminants or from non-point source pollution. It's the chemistry that ultimately matters to our bodies. And I mention this because contaminants of emerging concern and non-point pollution are problems that I really have no readily apparent solution for. They are problems of global significance that require cooperation between world governments and the industries that literally prop up our society. What I believe makes brownfield contamination unique is that by comparison, these are localized problems, and there already exists the tools to solve them. The databases for tracking and measuring community burdens are easily accessible. Threats to sensitive populations can be quantified with data and through local knowledge that shows how the community is affected, why a community would need funding for assessment or cleanup or redevelopment. The data builds supporting arguments that illustrate how obtaining that funding will help to reduce and eliminate these issues, and who doesn't want to reduce and eliminate environmental issues? Our federal government's executive branch has currently set very ambitious environmental and infrastructural goals, which allows the EPA and other agencies to set aside some unprecedented amounts of grant money for brownfield redevelopment activity. I'm talking like millions of dollars in individual grants, totaling maybe billions. That's actually partially why we're here now. As part of the TAB team, that's Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities at NJIT, it's my job to be a technical resource for entities navigating the redevelopment process. You see, we're provided funding by the EPA so that we can in turn provide free educational forums and workshops, boot camps at conferences or in webinars like this one. NJIT has been a TAB provider since 2008 and is currently the TAB provider for EPA Regions 2 and Region 4 that I have illustrated here. A large part of what we do, though, is one-on-one technical assistance. I work directly with local governments and nonprofits that seek our help with things like prioritizing brownfield sites for redevelopment, obtaining funding, understanding regulations or environmental reports, reviewing grant application drafts, etc. We're a multidisciplinary team of planners, engineers, environmental scientists like myself, and social scientists, and we tailor our assistance to specific community needs. We've helped hundreds of communities throughout the country with their brownfield projects, and again, assistance is all provided free of charge to nonprofits and local governments. Free. All right, thanks so much for your time today listening to my webinar. Please reach out with any feedback or follow-up questions, and I don't know, I don't think I've timed myself properly, but we should have about 5 to 10 minutes for questions and general discussion. And with that, I'll kick it back off to Fatima.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe, for that informative presentation. I hope everyone learned something new and feels empowered to use the tools highlighted today for positive changes in their own communities. I know whenever I have a problem that I have to deal with, having as much tools as possible in my toolkit is really beneficial. So that's great to see that, you highlighted some of the more complicated things that could happen in our environments, like you highlighted the bad, but there is still hope. There's things we could do to address those issues. So now we're on our Q&A session. So let's see if anyone has any questions. Feel free to type into the Q&A box, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. I did see some individuals put in some questions into the chat. That's fine too. We're monitoring that as well. So the first question is, can you explain the difference between downstream and downgradient? I believe you spoke about that during the contaminant exposure portion of your presentation.
I did. So when I When I say downstream, I typically am thinking of like a surface water body where like there's a flowing stream and something is downstream of it. Down gradient is in my head, I'm thinking about the way that water flows through the ground in groundwater, where it can be controlled by things like gravity, but there might be other like physical things that drive the way that that water's flowing. So the term downstream in regards to groundwater flow may not be super accurate. It's just down gradient, down away from an area of, it wants to move from like high potential to low potential, basically. So for me, it's just a matter of semantics.
Gotcha, no problem. I hope that helped clarify that question. We have another question. How can governments and nonprofits help individuals feel empowered to help reuse the brownfield site without scaring folks about the potential health impacts of contaminants?
I think, well, part of it is just general community outreach and education about contaminants. I think contamination is a scary thing to a lot of people because it's complicated, so it's hard to learn about. I think just in terms of making that extra effort to reach out to individuals within a community and address specific community fears. There's also like as an individual, there are steps that you can take. You can start a dialogue with your local government, maybe your mayor or county clerk or something like that. And, let them know that they may not be aware that there are these brownfield grant monies available this year and stuff like that. So I think it's about civic engagement as a two-way street.
Totally agree. So if anyone has any questions, we'll give some time, a few moments. Again, I want to remind you if you feel more comfortable speaking your questions, feel free to raise your hand. You could raise it. You'll be able to do that on the toolbar below, and that way we'll unmute you and you could ask your question verbally. Or if you're more comfortable, feel free to put it in the Q&A box.
Let's see here. I'm seeing someone, Reese Brosco, has their hand up. I don't know if that was intentional or I think I need to allow you to talk. There you go.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
All right, wonderful. I don't know if this is really a question, but I just wanted to share that, this session was super helpful for me. I'm sort of a newer brownfields professional, and my organization, Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, we're based in the South Bronx, and we're doing like a New York State BOA right now. We've applied to the EPA equivalent. I know it was formerly called an area-wide plan. I'm not sure what it's called now. But we're also conducting, we've also won an award for the Environmental Justice Community Problem Solving Grant from the EPA. And with that work, we're hoping to do the community health impact assessment around brownfield remediation, essentially like what are the positive health outcomes of remediating our nearby brownfield sites. And so, was curious if you had any thoughts about that. I know you had mentioned sort of on a physical level or like in terms of individuals' bodies, sometimes it's hard to disaggregate, what are the impacts, from point source solution, pollution or contamination, pollution versus, non-point source. But yeah, just wanted to share that out and thank you again for the presentation.
Absolutely. I'm happy that it was informative for you, and I do hope that you have some good takeaways to help with your organization's mission. That sounds awesome. See here. Any other questions? Any comments?
Yeah, hey, it's Elise. Just kind of jumping off of what Reese just said, Carrie is presenting a webinar that kind of discusses life after BOA. I don't know, Carrie, I know you introduced it at the beginning. of the webinar, but if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, just to kind of follow up with what Reese said.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, not what I plugged up at the top, but I do also have another virtual workshop that's coming up on March 28th. And we'll, start advertising that. But yeah, it's called Life After BOA designation, and it's specific to New York State. So the New York State communities that are in the Brownfield Opportunity Area program, what they can do to, designate community champions that'll help them, really bring their beginning stages of planning their brownfield reuse into actual redevelopment and revitalization. And we'll be joined by someone from the Department of State as well, the New York State Department of State BOA program, to speak on that. So, yep, that's going to be March 28th at 11 a.m. So feel free to join us for that.
Thanks for sharing that. Speaking of news, actually, sorry to bring you back on, Carrie. I know a few individuals may have missed the pitch earlier before the webinar started. If you wanted to talk about your upcoming webinar on the 7th for climate change and Brownfields 101, and then afterwards, Elise, if you'd like to tell us more about your upcoming webinar as well on March 21st, Brownfields, A Story to Tell.
Yeah, so before the 28th, on March 7th, which is next Thursday at noon, is Climate Change and Brownfields 101. It's going to be myself and William Kritzenberger from Topology, which is a planning firm here in New Jersey. I'll be going over how you can redevelop your brownfield site to make it more resilient to climate threats like flooding and extreme heat. And I'll also be talking about how you can reuse your brownfield site using renewable energy and integrating energy efficiency into that. And then we'll have William speak about the planning work that he's done in the city of Perth Amboy, New Jersey. And even though we'll have examples from New Jersey, I'll also allude to examples across the country, and it'll be broadly applicable for folks all over the country, including the Caribbean as well. So hope you can join us.
Super excited. And as you can see on this page right here, coming up on March 21st, I will be speaking for a webinar titled Brownfields, A Story to Tell. I'm going to be joined by Maria Kohler, who is an adjunct professor of civil and environmental engineering at NJIT. She's also the president and owner of Hydrotechnology Consultants, Inc. And we're going to be discussing the significance of being able to tell the history of the impacts of contamination to our neighborhoods and the humanity in redeveloping sites and its potential. So why is this important? We really want to effectively tell the story of our project because it's very critical to accessing resources such as funding and partnerships. So join this webinar if you want to learn techniques to reimagine the way you describe your brownfield redevelopment project to maximize a positive impact for communities, officials, and organizations. And if, like me, you're really interested in creative writing, kind of incorporating that creativity and freedom of thoughts into, things like grants, this would be a really good webinar to join.
Thank you so much. Those sound really awesome. If I wasn't already registered for it, because I'm emceeing them, I would definitely register for them as well. I also popped in those links, those LinkedIn page events. So if you're interested in attending those, you could go ahead and register from there. Also, if you're part of our mailing list, we'll send out information as it gets closer as well. I also did, to continue the discussion today about Joe's presentation, Brownfield Contaminants and Human Health. I also popped in that LinkedIn page. We'd love for you to continue the dialogue. If you have any additional questions that you couldn't ask today, or you're ruminating about it a little bit afterwards, you're like, I wish I asked that question. Feel free to do so. Also, again, here at NJIT TAB, we're available to assist you. Feel free to reach out at any time. Also, just know that I said it before the session, I'll say it again, our presentation as well as the slides Any other questions that we'd like to share that were answered will be on our website, again at www.njit.edu/tab. Also, I believe those links might be in our LinkedIn as well. So if we don't have any more questions, again, we thank you for spending some time with us today. I hope you all have a great day and many successes wherever you are in your brownfield journey. We'd love to see you again for these future webinars. If not, again, we're always here to assist.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks again to everyone joining me, and definitely join these future webinars. I won't be leading them, so there probably won't be the technical difficulties that occur. I won't be there to take a hatchet to the Zoom session. So thanks a lot, and I hope everyone has a great day.